You ready to enter the lost decade of horror?
We're going to the movies!
It wouldn't be October if we didn't bring back acclaimed writer-director David Weiner to discuss 90s horror.
Miss me. It's scary, it's funny, it's twisted, and it's sexy.
Well, maybe not so sexy.
Aren't you going to say hello?
In a world filled with intergalactic space battles, metahuman destruction on a global scale, and psychopathic serial hauntings, there's only one team who can make sense of it all. When your world is overrun with rampant pop culture, call Loop and Larry, Guardians of Geek.
80-second explosion.
Oh, God.
I don't know.
Oh my God. Hey everybody, I'm Loop.
And I'm Larry.
And normally behind us you'd see like the Loop and Larry logo or something behind us, but we've got a very special episode. We're going to be talking In Search of Darkness. It's a brand new doc coming out of 90 to 94. We've talked to our special guest before, and Larry, why don't you introduce him?
We are back. It is October, and it would not be the scary month, without bringing back our favorite all-time guest, David Weiner, writer-director of the In Search of Darkness series, and like, we just cannot get enough of the horror. And fortunately, David can't either, so he keeps giving us more and more, and we can't stop talking about it. So
I've got a problem.
Well, we're here to help you through it. We'll talk it out. We'll talk it out. You'll feel better after we're finished. So
Before you even jump in, I'm just going to say my therapy is making 5-6 hour documentaries. It's the only way I can manage my problem.
Interestingly enough, our therapy is watching them.
Yes, that's right. It 100% is.
So it does balance.
There's a reciprocal thing going on.
Yeah,
exactly. So let me start with you sent us the press release for the new film. The new film, by the way, is called In Search of Darkness, 1990 to 1994. So it's
correct.
Starting the new decade, which is fantastic. And of this, you said the 90s was a much more exciting time for horror filmmaking, TV programming, and bold innovation. It was much more than we remember. There was an abundance of creative vision, vibrant approaches, and insane indie entries. And it was also a time of major transition, growing pains, and evolution for horror filmmakers. This is a big, bold statement. Can you back that up?
That's pretty lofty. Now I got to back it up, don't I?
Yes. Yes. So tell us about this. Yeah. What was the transition like going from the 80s to the 90s?
Well, I think based on what you read, which is what I wrote, it's important to say that I think a lot of people, when they think of the 90s, sometimes their minds are not full of a lot of titles. I think everyone, it's not like a complete empty decade where everyone had their memory wiped. But after the supernova glow of the 80s and all the amazing horror that came out of the 80s and the stylized things and the subgenres and everything that we got, by the time the 90s came along, people were like, okay, well, I remember Scream, but that was 96. People really have to jog their memories. And I think, it's very simple to draw a dividing line between, the December 31st, 1989 and January 1st, 1990, and say it's a whole new decade and it's a whole new era of filmmaking. But as we all know, it just doesn't quite work that way. And so by focusing, I normally cover a decade at a time. This time we're doing half the decade, and then a year from now we'll finish up. I'll answer one of your questions that you haven't asked, which is we're going to go to, straight to 95 to 1999. About a year from now, I'll be knocking on your door saying, hey, you want to talk more 90s horror? But Ultimately, the answer is there was a lot of struggle. There was a lot of growing pains. There was a lot of what felt like still the 80s, especially with horror icons like, Chucky and Pinhead and Freddy and Jason and all those folks. But there were filmmakers who were also, John Carpenter, David Cronenberg, Sam Raimi, types, Wes Craven, who are either like, I know exactly what I'm going to do and how I'm going to push the envelope on creative filmmaking and storytelling, and deconstruct what I've created that was already iconic. Or they're like, gosh, how am I going to do this? Do I still want to do horror? Do I want to veer away from horror? There's so much to discuss. And lastly, I'll just plant the seed. And we've talked about this, but it's important to mention. I think one of the reasons why the 90s, especially in the first half of the decade, is a bit dismissed or oft maligned, or it's a big, what was happening that was good? I'm not quite sure. I can't remember, is because of the advent of amazing CGI, amazing effects, where practical effects, which were already at their zenith by the end of the 80s, they were going strong, but then all of a sudden you have dinosaurs and you have, liquid metal Terminators from the future. And you have Michael Jackson doing a video called Black and White, where everyone morphs into someone else. And everyone's saying, oh my gosh, this is brand new technology that we can use and should use in our movies. It's amazing. It's the best thing I've ever seen. Let's pay like 1/5 of the amount it costs to see what we can get.
And then you end up with Lawnmower Man.
Yeah, there you go.
And I can dive in and defend all these as elements of their time when things were brand new, but we can get into that.
Yeah, because you call this the lost decade, and I noticed that. And for me, it's kind of weird because the age that I think Larry and I are at, like I was finishing high school when the 80s finished. And then I went into the 90s in college, and I kind of forgot to watch movies for whatever reason, because it was just you were doing other things, and now I obviously, like at the end of the 90s I got back into it again, but
girls and drugs.
Well, that would be part of it. Yeah, that really. It's like I don't know. But do you think, like, what was the biggest thing when you were going through this doc? Because obviously you're getting into the minutia of the decade. What was something from the 90s to the 80s that you really super noticed that was really different in the 90s?
I think ultimately filmmakers collectively, now it's easy to sort of say there's a movement or something like that, this is piecemeal, but I think collectively filmmakers were trying to get away from a genre that still had a stigma on it, and they also wanted to create more intelligent storytelling to a certain degree, because they respected the audience. And there was a lot of filmmakers who knew that the audience had become incredibly savvy over the years about just the how filmmaking works, the tropes of filmmaking, Easter eggs in filmmaking, that kind of stuff like that, self-reflexive storytelling. So before we were calling things meta, things were already meta. And, people like Wes Craven or even John Carpenter, or Adam Marcus of Jason, director of Jason Goes to Hell, they're all saying, how do I build a different mousetrap? How do I approach horror and make it different and interesting? So I'm interested in this. How do I appease the audience so they can say, oh, wow, Mick Garris will do Sleepwalkers. It's yet another Stephen King movie that's a little more on the goofy side, but does every Stephen King movie have to be like as serious as Pet Sematary? Maybe not, but he's thinking, well, hey, I could have Death by Corncob, and I can pack scenes with cameos with Joe Dante and John Landis and Clive Barker, chit-chatting with Stephen King, and the audience who's in the know, they could be like, oh my God, look at that. But everyone else is just like eating their popcorn, not noticing or caring. So to answer your question, I think there was a certain faction of filmmakers who really trying to push things a little bit to be more challenging. And And when I mentioned the stigma of horror, I think a lot of studios were like, well, we want to have horror elements, but we don't want to call it horror because we get better box office if we say it's a movie that's more like Fatal Attraction, or a psychological thriller. So if we do The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, if we do Silence of the Lambs, no matter what the intensity of the material is, they're definitely not going to call it horror. Only the horror fans who know and can sniff this stuff out and don't care what you call it, they're still going to see it and they're going to appreciate it. But broader audiences and more money can see a movie like that, those that I mentioned, or something like Jacob's Ladder, for example. That's a little more challenging. Is that a horror film? Arguably yes, arguably not. In the end, it's supernatural, it's psychological, it's challenging, and it's interesting, and it's grittier, and it's different.
Do you think too, like, to use a lack of a better term, Hollywood, do you think it like horror went a bit more Hollywood in the 90s? And also, where's that blur line? Because horror was horror when we were in the 80s. And like you were saying, all of a sudden there's all these movies like Single White Female that they're horrific because it's something that's actually could happen to somebody. Like they're almost more realistic. And so there was this blur line I found in the 90s of these movies that could be, I guess they're horror, like, but a different type of horror. The 90s you started to see, and part of that, but I think like you're saying, maybe that's because things started to get more Hollywood and maybe there's less outlets maybe for horror to be shown at. I'm not really sure.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a multi-layered answer to the question because first of all, you mentioned Single White Female. Boy, if I had a roommate who had in their apartment, the apartment, or a neighbor or something like that, where someone died by 6-inch stiletto to their eye socket, I'd say that's pretty horrific. That was in a movie. That was in a mainstream movie that everyone's like, ooh, let's go on a date and go on a Friday night and watch, roommates want to kill each other and stalk each other first. That was the kind of entertainment that Hollywood was providing. And in the wake of Silence of the Lambs, most definitely Hollywood was just like, ooh, I smell money and I now smell Oscars, So let's have a run of A-listers do this, but hang on a second. Let's go back to the classics. Let's have Dracula, except we'll call it Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's more literary. It's more highfalutin. Let's have Mary Shelley's, Frankenstein. Let's have Interview with a Vampire, again, from a very popular literary source. Well, Stephen King's a little tired, so let's bring on all the Anne Rice fans. See if we can get that in, Jack Nicholson is sitting courtside at the Lakers game and he's just like, give Mike Nichols a call. Maybe we could probably do some werewolf film, but let's in the publishing world. So again, literary element there, but you have all these actors who are like, finally an opportunity to chew the scenery. And maybe get some awards in the process. Julia Roberts a little later, Mary Riley, it's like, all right, I'll play the housekeeper for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Let's see what happens. It's very much there. But when you said maybe there weren't enough theaters, so that's what you got. Hollywood is always following the almighty dollar and the almighty trends of what makes great box office. And so in the wake of Fatal Attraction, psychological thrillers, some erotic thrillers, if you put the word thriller in there, people are going to want to go. Basic Instinct does really, really well. People want to make movies like that. So maybe during that time, sure, there are horror movies coming theatrically, but the video store shelves are getting more and more packed with direct to video, straight to video films. And they're usually horror. They're usually sequels. They're usually low budget, like Full Moon Entertainment. And they're usually someone who bypassed the studio gatekeeping system by making their own movie practically in their backyard over a weekend, got really good art, got one person to make 100 videotapes, went door to door at the mom and pops and said, do you want to buy this? You need content. And they got it out there. Or you have indie filmmakers like Frank Henenlotter. They're like, I'll do Frankenhooker and I'll do Basket Case 2 and 3 because people want more Basket Case. These are all going tangentially parallel to all the big Hollywood releases. Boy, that was a real long answer, wasn't it?
I had a really long question too. So there you go.
I always kind of.
It's like those debates. I'm like taking notes. You got to get all your points.
Yeah, and hit them all.
It's my only political thing I'm going to say this whole
Yeah,
year.
Excellent.
probably good, probably good. I had this. I kind of always had this feeling that the '90s were almost a little bit of a throwback to the '70s, in that the '70s brought us like The Exorcist and The Shining, and sort of more of those sort of realistic thriller dramas that sort of came back, like you were saying, with Silence of the Lambs and Jacob's Ladder and those sorts of things. And I felt like, and maybe it's because I was younger in the '80s, we didn't see as many of those sorts of movies in the '80s, but then they sort of came back. And you probably nailed it with your with the awards motivation. People saw that, but I felt like there was a gap between, like, the end of the '70s and the beginning of the '90s, when we had like Exorcist and the Shining type of films, but now we're starting to see them again. So now you've got a more rounded horror genre. So you've got the splatter films, and you've got the full gore, but you've also got these really like heady uh thrillers that stick with you and traumatize you, rather than just making laugh hysterically at at the greatest kill you've ever seen. Do you feel that way? Like, do you feel that that's a thing?
Well, I think you make a good point there. I think there was on one hand there were the sequel after sequel after sequel, yet another Hellraiser, more Chucky, more Halloweens, but more Nightmare on Elm Street. Freddy dies and then Freddy's resurrected. That's a whole other story there. But I think people were still wanted to have the fun that and the mindlessness and the check your brain at the door and the predictability of and the predictability of the cheeseburger at McDonald's that you're going to have every weekend on the video shelf. It's always going to be reliable no matter where you are with the franchise. But on the other hand, actually, you mentioned Exorcist 3 comes out. And catches everyone off guard, because after Exorcist 2, you're like, well, are there locusts in this? I don't know. Do I need to see this? But it turns out, William Peter Blatty's like, I'm going to take the reins. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it my way, and I'm going to do it right. There's still a little studio interference there, but it's a wonderful, wonderful, compelling, Power of Christ compelling you film.
Yes.
It's really, really, really well done.
I still think of that woman on the ceiling. Like that still to this day haunts my mind. It lives rent free in my head to this very day.
Brad Dourif giving a haunting performance. There was just a lot going on. I mean, there was a whole serial killer subgenre that sort of the gates opened, with Silence of the Lambs, making that acceptable. You've got California with a K,
Oh, yes.
where David Duchovny and Michelle Forbes go on a road trip trying to go to the homes where actual serial killings took place, and they need money, people to ride with them to share in the gas money. It's a serial killer and his girlfriend, played by Brad Pitt and Juliette Lewis. Darker stuff was afoot, but also more clever stuff. I think it's important to mention, Wes Craven. I want to make sure that I mention that he was really at the forefront, paving the way for meta filmmaking and clever filmmaking and making entertainment filmmaking that was reflecting society, but it didn't shove that, that the vegetables down your throat. So you get a movie like People Under the Stairs, where, I mean, it essentially kind of hits you over the head with the haves and the have-nots, and a microcosm of post-Reagan America and trickle-down economics that aren't trickling down at all. But ultimately, you've got a film that is extremely and unexpectedly entertaining, but it says a lot about our society. I don't know. My mind is all over because I know so many references that we could add here, but I want to make sure that around that time, television was really getting into the horror act very much so. But you have Stephen King miniseries. There's a lot of horror series like Tales from the Crypt, Stephen King's It, things like that. X-Files. All these things are welcomed with open arms. So many people are enjoying more and more horror on television, and the setting is ripe for Twin Peaks to come. And that's not horror, but that sure ain't just a drama, you know.
No, it's
And
the movie was disturbing because I'm a huge Twin Peaks fan, and the series was kind of whimsical, kind of dark, but not like had quirky characters. And then David Lynch took the reins on the movie and stripped all that out, and it was there's some frightening images in that movie, and though it was very violent, especially at the end of it. Like
oh
spoiler
yeah.
alert, but
I was going to say, with that, it's like, David Lynch really sort of disrupted television and what you could do on television with Twin Peaks. But then when he's just like, all right, now I'm going to make the prequel of, Laura Palmer's final 7 days before she's murdered. And he's essentially like, oh, did you see Blue Velvet? That's for children.
Yeah, this is true. I also feel like going back to I'm comparing the 80s to the 90s still in my head.
Uh-huh.
The 80s was a decade of excess, right? I think everybody sort of refers to the 80s
Greed is good.
the decade of excess. I feel like the 90s was the hangover. Everybody was sort of
Mhm.
so the 90s, people just wanted to, they were in a darker place. They had, lived the excessive life for 10 years. They're coming down, then so I think that, that is reflected in the kind of movies that we were seeing too. In the 80s, it was gore, 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 as big and as bold as you could make it, and over the top. And then we start like getting back into all right, we're going to tell you the real stories that are really going to scare you because they could really happen. So I feel like you could see society changing over the decade and into the new decade with what they're watching.
You really can. Candyman is like a great reflection of that. Candyman. I mean, the Hangover was pretty intense. There's a great line from one of the experts in our film. Her name is Annie Choi. She's the co-author of a book called Bleeding Skull, and she says if the '80s was cocaine, the '90s was heroin.
Yeah.
It was a very, very different vibe, and yeah. So again, the haves and the have-nots and socio-political drama and trauma. You've got the Rodney King. The LA riots as a result of the Rodney King verdict in Los Angeles is really sort of a symbolic of how things were going around the world. North America, but America was very much reeling from the reality of the trickle down economics weren't trickling down at all. And the 1% was living high still. Everyone else was struggling. And we were starting to realize that things aren't as good as we've been told they are, or as we've been told they would be. But on the flip side, there's still lots of sort of 80s style films and lots of fantasy and escapism, and everything from like a movie like Tremors, which is like a good old fashioned entertaining monster movie like Jaws on land. But you also have like, Army of Darkness, and you also have like Peter Jackson doing like Brain Dead, aka Dead Alive in America. And it's practical effects extravaganzas. It's really creative and amazing filmmaking on a small budget on display. These are movies that are innovative and entertaining by filmmakers. Ron Underwood directed Tremors. They're creating a lot of escapism, whether it's for general audiences or for hardcore audiences. If you get two things, behind door number one, you get the instructional, reflective horror where you're looking at yourself in the mirror, or you get door number two, where you've had a couple brewskis and you get to escape and you don't have to think about your own problems for the evening. And you can see other people's go through the ringer and you're just fine sitting in your chair laughing the whole time. So I think that first half of the 90s also reflects a lot of that in terms of the way people approach their horror.
Absolutely.
Was there any films in this that because obviously you have to revisit a lot of films that you haven't seen in it forever and like The Guardian or something like, is there any films that you were like, you know what, this is actually way better than I thought it was originally, or I totally forgot about this film and this is actually quite good?
No, The Guardian, you mentioned it, so I want to talk about it because The Guardian is one of those films where I've saw most of these films in the theater. When I was I graduated college in 1990, and so I started my career in entertainment right away. I aimed my car to Los Angeles and went to Hollywood to work on movies. And so I felt it was my responsibility as soon as I got here, to watch as many movies as possible, to see what the competition was like, what filmmakers are doing, what the trends are, and of course to be entertained, and a lot of these movies, like The Guardian, that I saw in the theater when it came out, and I look back at it and say, I can't remember if that was good or bad. I just remember it was odd and weird. And of course, because it was William Friedkin, I expected something exorcisty, and it wasn't. And that's the simple, oversimplified way you would approach some of these movies sometimes. But here, to me, I was like, 30 years later, I'm making a documentary about the 90s. I'm like, I can't wait to revisit these movies and see if I have a new perspective on it. One of the cool things about The Guardian is that the writer of The Guardian, Stephen Volk, who also wrote Ghostwatch for the UK, we could talk about that. Ultimately, he sat down to talk about Ghostwatch and The Guardian, and he wrote Gothic. That was his first big produced screenplay. Gothic being about writing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein on this Lake Geneva, that whole tale, Lord Byron. It's very, very fun to sit down with these folks and get a new perspective. And I rewatched it, and I was just like, this is actually, it doesn't quite know what it wants to be, but there's so many wonderful horror elements. It's very sort of Omen nanny-ish. It was a film that was originally going to be directed by Sam Raimi, and he was working on it with
I could see that.
Volk. Of course, yeah, Killer Trees. Let's get Sam Raimi. and then Sam Raimi went off to do Darkman, and the producer of it was also William Friedkin's agent. So they brought William Friedkin on, and then I'm just spilling all the beans here because it's an interesting story, but it's like they at one point were not quite sure. It's based on a supernatural story that's a book. But ultimately, they didn't quite know how to make it heads or tails of it cinematically. They were going to make it like a Hand That Rocks the Cradle story at one point, take out all the supernatural elements. And then they said, that's a bad idea. From the director of The Exorcist comes a non-supernatural tale. And they're like, no, it's got to be that. And of course, Hand That Rocks the Cradle comes out and does really, really well. So maybe they were honest. I revisited many, many films that I had not seen since in 30 years. I have my mainstays that I'm always going back to intermittently. One movie that I go back to all the time is Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead, which I think is exceptional and really well done. And it's one of my favorites. And it's my get in the mood for Halloween movie that I pop in practically every, late September, early October.
Yep.
I mean, all I could say, I start sounding like a listicle, but ultimately I have the greatest homework in the world. I get to revisit these movies. I try and determine if I think it's compelling enough to talk about, or if it's not compelling at all, but I have someone who can represent it, who really can make it a compelling case as to why they think it's important or how it fits in the old big jigsaw puzzle of 90s horror. So, lots of surprises for me where I said, this is much better than I remember.
Even Troll 2. Did you watch it again?
I plead the fifth.
I have to say, and this is just between the three of us because nobody else is listening right now. Troll 2 is my absolute guiltiest pleasure. I've watched that movie probably 3 times this year. I can't get enough of it.
Well, we should point people to the documentary that yes. Can only do, I have a wonderful problem to have. I cover a lot of films.
Yeah.
So I only have a limited amount of time. So I do take into consideration if something's been done about a film where they've given so much more time to it in a documentary setting. Sometimes I'm like, well, you got to include it because everybody wants it. Other times I'm like, well, it's kind of been done.
Yeah.
Maybe I can give it some lip service, but maybe I'd rather use that time for another title that people aren't aware of. So that's sort of my good problem that I always have with these films.
You probably
And-
made a good choice there.
Yeah. And speaking of that problem and homework, one of the things I love about your docs is that they encourage viewers to watch things that they hadn't seen before, or and that's what happened with this one. I know the doc hasn't been released yet, but there have been snippets, there have been trailers, and there have been the thing that struck me in the trailer that I've seen so far, with the pieces that I've seen so far, was Ghost Watch, and for
Ah,
some reason that totally missed me when it came out, and I don't know if it was because it was a BBC program. I don't know if it aired.
yeah, it was in the BBC in 1992 Halloween night, only
Yeah,
there. So if you're in Canada, if you're in North America, you're anywhere else, you wouldn't have caught it. And because, and I won't dive into it, but because it was a one-time deal, it disappeared.
yeah,
Yeah.
gone. But I thought, what is this thing? And I was so intrigued. I did find it. So I watched it just a couple of weeks ago, and it is available again. And it was so interesting because it was something I had never seen before. It was Lube. Do you know this? Have you seen this Ghost
I've
Watch?
never seen the movie. No.
Okay, so it's not a movie. It was a TV. It was a TV special, and
Oh, special.
essentially, yeah, essentially, it was like, I think they describe it sort of as War of the Worlds on TV, because it was presented as if it was a real
Like
newscast.
the Orson Welles radio broadcast in 1938,
Yes.
where everyone thought, when they did War of the Worlds on Halloween night, everyone thought it was real because they missed
Yeah.
the beginning.
Yes, and that's what this sort of is. So it looks like a real news broadcast, and it's about Halloween, and doing reporters investigating paranormal activity in a haunted house. It'll be a fun little news story, and then everything goes off the rails. But it was such a cool experience because it was something I'd never seen before. You presented it in your doc. I know it's going to be there, so it encouraged me to watch. And so now I've added that to my list of things that I've seen and can talk about. And I think that's a big draw with all of the docs that you've done so far, is that there are so many movies out there, that none of us could have seen them all at the time that they were
Yeah.
released. And some we just still haven't seen. So it just gives all of us the opportunity to say, I've heard of that one. Okay, now I've seen a little bit of it. Now I've heard the director talk a little bit about it. I'm intrigued and I need to find it. So I mean, it's like what Quentin Tarantino does when he brings back actors like Travolta, and it makes people interested in them again. Your
Yeah,
docs are the Tarantino of documentaries, because they're making us interested in all of these films again.
you're the first person to say that, because I usually get the Ken Burns of documentaries.
Oh yeah.
But they're ultimate, if they serve no purpose other than to curate titles for people to discover things that they didn't know existed, or they had heard of but now they know more, or they never really thought about it, it was relevant to them and they didn't quite care, but then I presented it, I had the people who talk about it presented it in a way that intrigues you and says, oh, I never thought of it that way. Even Troll 2, it's like it's easily dismissed, but when you get the behind the scenes tale, it's more intriguing to revisit these movies, because some of the triumphs and challenges behind the scenes. It makes it a more interesting and layered watch. Like one I at this stage in the game, this is my fourth In Search of Darkness, and of course I did In Search of Tomorrow as well. I have learned slowly, I might add, that what the audience really, really, really wants is a absolute a buffet with the delicious, the marshmallow pudding, and of course, the roughage and the vegetables and the meat and the filet mignon, but they also want the real, macaroni and cheese as well. And so what I ultimately provide now, especially after In Search of Darkness 3, is the big studio wide releases, the Oscar winners, the A-listers, and the you never heard it because it went straight to video and it didn't even go to your mom and pop store. And so my spider sense tingles when I'll be talking to someone like Shinya Tsukamoto, about Tetsuo, And I'm doing my research about that because I get to include him. I get to go to Japan and put him in my documentary. And I'm like, we got to talk about Haruko the Goblin, where it's based on a manga where you have these. I don't even want to spoil it, but there's enough there where all you need to know is that there are all these creatures and spiders with women's faces freaking out the local kids. And it's so nightmarish. It's wonderful. And I just think to myself, holy crap. There are people who know this and champion it, but not too many. So here's my opportunity to share it with a huge audience who appreciates this stuff.
Yeah. Can I talk about the process for a second? Because I always interested in the process of making this doc. Like when you sit down, this is day one, you're sitting down, you don't like, how do you figure out, like, number one, what movies you're going to do, and two, like, do you figure out the movies, then figure out kind of who you want to talk to, or do you think I can get this person, so maybe we should add this movie? Like, what's your thought process? Because I'm sure that you pulled a few hairs out just trying to put this thing together at some point. You're talking a 6-hour documentary, or almost 6 hours. Like, that's a lot of material and a lot of interviews and a lot of movies. And what's your process to start this off? Like, I find that very fascinating.
Well, when I look at a decade, the first thing I do is I go like this. So actually, this time was arguably a little easier because I get to do a half decade and then I'll do another half decade. Yeah. I'm kidding. I mean, I don't, because I ultimately, well, we've talked about the homework that's involved. I mean, it literally starts with a Google search, 90s horror, and you start looking at the things that pop up, and you're like, oh yeah, wait, that's a title I don't know, and you go, I go down the rabbit hole, because I'm like, of course I got to put that, and what I do is I start breaking down each year. I just think, what are notable titles, and you realize very quickly, especially with the 90s, when you're just like, well. I will freely admit I had that collective amnesia too. I'm like, well, what comes to mind? My favorites, Brain Dead and Tremors and Army of Darkness and Bram Stoker's Dracula, Silence of the Lambs. Yeah, of course, you stop at Silence of the Lambs and you say, well, okay, now do I have to consider, is that, horror or thriller? And I'm like, well, guy, it's about serial killers and people being carved, for their skin, for women's clothing. So yeah, I think that qualifies. Yeah. But to simplify my answer, because I'm incapable of that. It's it starts with a list of a wide variety of things, and then I'm just like, well, what do I definitely want to do? What's a maybe, and what's not going to happen at all. But there's also a little leeway of like, all right, now I'm going to try and reach out to all these movies that I know I want, see who I can get, to represent it. And it's always a bonus where if I get someone who has done more than one film over the course of a half decade or a decade, more bang for your buck, because then they could talk about multiple projects. And that to me is exciting, because I'm like, oh, that's great. They're not there for one film and one film only, but I really wanted to go out of my way to get some more obscure things. I wanted to educate myself, and I wanted to be like, oh, if I haven't heard, I've never claimed to know more than everybody else, but I might know one title more than the next person. That makes me an expert, But ultimately, I'm just like, if I haven't heard it, I'm just like, heard of it. I'm like, oh, okay, this is cool. Let's put this in the I'm even more intrigued column, because this is, if I haven't heard of it, even if I haven't seen it, but I've usually heard of it. But if there's a title there where I'm like, or going back to the 80s, because it just popped in my mind. It's just like, well, I never got around to Microwave Massacre. Now's my chance, Anyway, so I don't know if that fully answers your question, but that you got to start somewhere, and it's a combination of a good variety of titles, and getting the talent who is in front of the camera or behind the camera, or experts who are incredibly knowledgeable, who would know about this stuff, and can speak intelligently about it. That's really kind of where it starts. And then what ultimately happens is then I start killing babies immediately. I'm like, all right, now I'm not going to have time because I'm doing television, I'm doing movies, I'm doing studio films, I'm doing straight to video, I'm doing mid-range stuff. I now have no time because I only have X amount of time. You start doing the mathematical stuff where you're like I'm going to do chapters in between talking about stuff too.
Yeah.
So even if I do a 5-hour film, just the law of mathematical equations, it just pushes everything wider and wider and wider. And the more I want to include, the less time I get for each segment. And so, see, like it's a problem.
Do you ever sit in edit? Do you ever sit in editing and just like go?
You're stressing me out, man.
Did we talk about this already? Like this is like a 6-hour doc. I would imagine you'd be like, there'd be times it just got confusing of what you've talked about and what you haven't talked about, and like
well,
obviously you figure it out ahead of time. But
listen, I'll go show this real quickly, but it's probably all white. You can't even see, but it's all organized. It's all organized. And so I have it by year. I have it by US release date, because if I do IMDb date, it comes out 5 different times in 5 different countries and 5 different video and theatrical formats. So yeah, it's just we wanted to start with a 3-hour documentary because we kind of thought, well, we'll divide the decade in half. We'll just keep it shorter and more manageable. That's another element that was at least the original intention.
Yes.
but I listen, leopard can't change his spots, right? And ultimately I know that the audience loves and appreciates more bang for their buck, more films, more things to discover. And it's the way these films are designed, as you've seen and you could get up and go and come back. You could do it year by year. You could watch a couple segments, or you could sit the whole way through without a break, wearing an adult diaper, and you're good.
Which is what I did, minus the.
And he's doing right now.
Have you noticed as you've released these documentaries that you've got more that more doors have opened for you? And the reason I ask that is because I see that this one includes Mike Flanagan. You've got Mike Flanagan in this doc. I happen to be a bit of a fanboy when it
He's
comes
even
to
trying to look like him as well.
I try my best to look like Mike Flanagan, and I noticed that he's in this doc, and that was so exciting for me. But yeah, it is me. It's not him. But I mean, do you have you noticed that after having released the first 3 that like is it easier for you to get access to people like Mike Flanagan, or
it's easier and harder, I went out because this is 30 years ago instead of 40 years ago. There are plenty of A-listers who are just not interested in sitting down for a documentary. They're still busy. They're still working, and a lot of people would politely decline. But it still was harder. But then on the flip side, someone like Mike Flanagan, that was for him. I'm very fortunate. He saw I live In Search of Darkness. Yeah, when Akela Cooper, writer of Malignant and Megan and The Nun 2, and amazing writer, sci-fi and horror and the like. Boy, it's the greatest feeling when I have her information. I reach out to her. I say, would you be interested? I sent it. A minute later, hells yeah, let's do this.
Wow.
I love this. I'm so excited. Thank you for asking me, because this is really cool and fun for me. So a lot of people sometimes are watching these on Shudder, or they're just fans, and their names are in the credits or pseudonyms or something like that. But ultimately, I get a lot of people who say, I'm happy to be in this. I mean, Robert Englund said it. He wasn't around for part 1, but when part 2 came along, he's just like, I'm so sorry if my rep said no for part 1. I've seen your doc. I think it's wonderful. It's hot. I like being in hot things. I'm happy to do this. And I'm just like, thanks, Robert Englund.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, it's for us, it's it's all the nostalgia. Like we're all, reliving all those things, but so are they. Like they're reliving those times too. So I can imagine how fun it would be for them to go back and talk about the experience that they've had, and how, like, the legacy that they've left behind, and in creating these films, and you're giving them the outlet to do that. I mean, there aren't a lot of places that they could go, other than, I guess, podcasts and things like that, that will live on forever. So that Robert Englund interview, that Mike Flanagan interview, those things will live forever, and they'll be a part. I mean, they're already a part of the genre, but now they're a part of reliving the genre, and loving the genre, and
Yeah. Well,
like,
I think with the 90s also, I think a lot of people don't have the same love as for the 80s. And so a lot of these actors also who, actors and directors and creatives who were there in the 70s, in the 80s and the 90s, their careers continued. It's really the ultimate validation for us and for the series and for me when people are happy to come back. Heather Langenkamp, John Carpenter, Alex Winter, Mick Garris, having these folks come back, Charlie Band, and they're just like, yeah, of course, there's more to talk about, and there's more to talk about that people aren't as interested in as they are the 80s, arguably. They don't say that, but you could tell in the way that they respond and what they're enthusiastic to talk about. But so many of these folks had a career that was just as strong or evolved and went in different ways, like Doug Bradley. Doug Bradley was just getting warmed up, with Pinhead and the Hellraiser movies. That was at the very late 80s. So the 90s, and of course we know he did lots of sequels, but he did Nightbreed, he did a movie called Killer Tongue, I mean, he's just like, are you kidding me? I get to talk about Killer Tongue? Sit back. Let's talk about it. Don Mancini, who created the Child's Play movies. Chucky Child's Play came out in 1988, and it just got started in the 90s, and 90, 91 back-to-back films, one that did really, really well and what that didn't do very well at the box office. And so it's very cool to have, Don Mancini be very candid about, yeah, it was really great. I thought this is how you live in Hollywood. They just say make movie after movie after movie. I was not prepared for the disappointment that was the experience politically at the studio and box office wise with Child's Play 3, and it gets to the point sometimes, or even with Stephen Volk in The Guardian, sometimes they're like, do I have to talk about it? Or people are a bit apologetic, and I'm just like, no, 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 no. There's a whole audience here that wants to hear the story, that are very interested. We're not looking for the dirt, but your candor is very important to this story.
That's actually a good point. Did you ever run into, in any of your docs, 1, 2, 3, or this one? Did you ever run into people who said, "I don't want to revisit. It was not a high point in my life." Were there films that they look at and say, "You know what? It's out there. I can't go back there."
Yeah, well, I'll say, without giving away too much, John Carpenter's like that. Is anyone surprised that John Carpenter's like, do I really have to talk about this? Okay, I will. But he's very close and a little battle scarred from his Hollywood and studio experience navigating all these films, and he's the horror master, but he's just like, I'm a regular schmo. Where do I sit? Point me at the camera. But he's ultimately like, that was a disappointment because of this, or I like this about this and I enjoyed making this, but this was a result of something that didn't work out, so I ended up doing this because I wanted to do something next. He's much more practical about it, but Charlie Band, ran Full Moon Entertainment. I worked at Full Moon Entertainment in the early 90s. So that's kind of fun talking to him about movies, like literally talking about a movie like Demonic Toys that I worked on, doing locations, or Puppet Master 3. I did some second unit stuff on that, it's kind of cool to, and I was a runner for him, so I know where the bodies are buried. It was cool talking to him where he's just like, I'm like, I just list a movie and list a movie. He'd tell me a tale. It was pretty cool. I'd list a movie and he'd say, let's not talk about that one. What else you got?
Really?
And so, I won't name the title because he doesn't want to talk about it. But, there's some interesting things where I think there are some negative experiences with all these filmmakers. Some it's more a personal thing, some it's the way it's received. But collectively, they're human, there's stuff that we're all proud of. There's stuff that we kind of would like to hide. But if you're a filmmaker or an actor in Hollywood and everything is out for everyone to watch, you can't hide so well. And so sometimes, I talked to Will Wheaton for In Search of Tomorrow. And he's been very vocal about his mistreatment as a child actor. And at one point when I sat down with him to talk about his thoughts on sci-fi and Star Trek, and, he gave a great interview and stuff like that. I mentioned one thing. I'm like, well, we could talk about this for In Search of Darkness. And he's like, oh, I won't talk about that because that was a extremely negative personal experience for me.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, I don't want to bring you to that headspace. So check, moving on, no worries.
Exactly. But that's interesting for you because, we only see what we see on the screen, and for us, maybe that project that he worked on became one of our favorites and we thoroughly enjoyed it and we did it, but we don't know the background. And again, that's what these documentaries are so good at doing, is just opening us all up to what really goes on.
It's very surprising sometimes because you have people who it's their job to put on a facade and act and pitch, promote a movie, but I clued in a long time ago, especially in my Entertainment Tonight days, when I was very young and Pollyanna and naive in my early days. But I'd say, but blankety blank said it was a great movie, and then I saw it and it was absolute crap. It was terrible. But they were so enthusiastic about it, and it took me a little time to like, wait, what's the disconnect? Do they really think it's good? Or wait, maybe they were obligated to promote it and say great things about it.
Yeah.
Now what do I believe? I don't know. Maybe it's a big hype machine. I don't know. Yeah. One of the cool things about doing all these documentaries and these interviews for these documentaries so many decades later is, for the most part, the restraints are gone. And they'll tell you exactly what went down. Sometimes even too much, where I don't think it should be in my documentary, even though, and they never said, don't put that in there. They just said it. And I'm just like, you know what, this kind of messes with the flow of the celebration of something, where not that everything has to be happy and perfect, but there are moments where sometimes the vibe just takes it down. Yeah. And I'm like, listen, I'm sorry you had I'm sorry you had a negative experience, but I don't think it needs to be amplified and broadcast in this particular segment because it just doesn't quite fit. And it's a bit sad,
Yeah.
But now we're just talking depressing things.
I'm going to bring the vibe up a bit, and because I want to find out how people get this doc. Because this is something that I think that's why you're here, because we got to find out how people can actually get their hands on this, because we ordered it like a year ago, but there's people out there that maybe haven't gotten it yet.
Well, I appreciate you doing it a year ago, because the way we do it is we crowdfund it first. Then we make it, and then right when it's done, we have yet to do the credits. We do a final push over the line, and that's what we're doing. So midnight Halloween is the deadline. So now go to 90shorrordoc.com, 90s horrordoc.com, and you can still get your name in the credits alongside John Carpenter, Heather Langenkamp, Shinya Tsukamoto, Tom Savini, all the cool folks, even Mike Flanagan. You can have your name opposite Mike Flanagan and
the Flaniverse.
I got to tell you, Loop and I now have IMDb pages because our names appear in the credits of all of these docs.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
I feel like, it's time that we start IMDBing because, we're in there. We're part of this part of this world.
Well, these because of you guys and the other folks who back these and get to have your name in the credits and get to have it on your shelf, these movies wouldn't even be here if you didn't throw your support behind it, both financially and promotionally. These things really matter to us because we're a small company that makes these things. So yeah, if everyone goes to 90shorrordoc.com, you get your name in the credits. You get all sorts of cool swag. We have a couple new things this time around. We have a funky patch, that you can have, a cool certificate. There's lots of different packages. You can get t-shirts and things like that, whatever level you want to do. And then you get not only the film as a digital copy at the end of November, you get the physical media. We make and manufacture and distribute it ourselves. That happens in December, beginning of January. You have it in your hands. And pretty cool stuff.
You guys just celebrated your 5th anniversary, right?
Yeah, well, we just did that with a very cool thing earlier in the month on October 6th, which was the date, the 5th anniversary of the date where we premiered the first In Search of Darkness at Beyond Fest in Hollywood and had a premiere, and it was super cool. And so we figured, how do we give back to the fans in some way, shape, or form, especially because you can't get In Search of Darkness anywhere. It used to be on Shudder, but it's not there anymore. In Search of Darkness 2, can't get it anywhere. In Search of Darkness 3, still on Shudder. It'll disappear eventually. So the thing is, you got to get these things in your hands. But what we did was we decided, why don't we put it on YouTube for free for everyone to access and play it on a loop for 24 hours. We'll play it on a loop in Larry for 24 hours. But we did that, and it was very, very cool because at any given time, I'd sort of come in and look at the community, because the community can chat alongside as the movie is streaming for free. And there were anywhere between 350 and 450 people watching and chatting and talking. And I jump in, and it's kind of like a Reddit AMA, when I did it, and it was very cool. And don't hold me to it, but it did so well that I think we're going to do it one more time on Halloween night or Halloween day. So, so stick, if you follow our socials, which are still 80s Horror Doc on Twitter, X, and Instagram and Facebook, just follow us on 80s Horror Doc, and you could find out if you're going to be able to get to see it again. And also how to order at 90shorrordoc.com. There you go. That's all my plugs.
Yeah, perfect.
And let me just add one more thing to that. You talked about the swag that you get. If you're watching us on YouTube, Loop and I behind us have the poster for the new doc. And I have to tell you, these are some of the coolest movie posters I've literally ever seen. And I'm not even blowing that out of proportion. They are so cool. The detail in them is just amazing. They're like old school movie posters from the 70s and 80s. They're really, really cool. And if you buy the right package, you get those too. And
actually every package gets it, unless I think if you get a digital only, you don't get it. But everything that's a physical media, everyone gets 2 posters. They get the poster behind you, which is by artist Dave Morrell, who's an amazing artist. And then Clayton Benj, who is our in-house art director. He also does one where, you've got the kid in front of the TV. He did an updated versions. You can see the original behind me.
Yeah.
But ultimately, ding, ding, ding. But ultimately, we have one for 90s horror, or first half of 90s horror now as well. So the swag is super duper cool. Dave Morrell is incredibly talented, and there's a whole sort of maze concept behind you. You're in the lost decade. Let's see what we discover around every corner. But it's very cool to have that and frame it on your wall,
Absolutely.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, David, we used a lot of your time up, and we love talking to you every time you come on, and we're looking forward to, you already kind of hinted there'd be a next doc of the 95 to 99. So we'll for sure to have you on again to talk about that, because I'm excited about that half as well. Cause it seems like a whole different half of the 90s in the first half.
Very different, very, very evolved, very, yeah, all lessons
very teen heavy in the second half.
Right, there's a whole teen cycle that goes on there. Scream, but I Know What You Did Last Summer, and The Craft, and all sorts of movies like that. Yeah,
we've got to get you up to your 10th appearance.
Yes,
you're at 7.
Larry's obsessed with this.
I really am. You're at 7 right now, so we've only got 3 more appearances before you get the official.
Guys, no more frame certificates.
No, next up is the smoking jacket.
Yeah, that's up next. Yeah,
but that I like that.
You
I'd be
got to
more
keep
than
doing the
happy.
docs and kind of keep coming back. So I'm just saying.
No, you guys deserve the frame certificate for having me on over and over to as cheerleaders and supporters and fellow geeks. I love watching. I love not only do you do the coolest, fun, and most entertaining promos for all these appearances, but I love the feed when I look at your social media. You guys are at all these conventions and taking
Cons, yeah.
cosplaying and hanging with the legends. And I'm envious when I look at those things. It's very good.
Thank you so much for being here, and we appreciate your time for sure.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here. And I really appreciate it, guys. Have a great rest of your spooky season and Halloween. And I hope to see you next time. Absolutely.
How cool is that having David Weiner back? I love when he comes on. He's got so many stories, and it's just like he's just a wealth of information.
It's true. And I love being able to relive our childhoods through his work. It makes us feel young all the time. It's so good. I love it. And we'll keep having him on as long as he keeps creating these docs. And from the sound of it, he's going to be on for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And more and more, and that's awesome.
And we have him on, but like, honest to God, I will endorse these docs to the end of time, because it's not, and we're not just saying that. Like, we both love them. I own them all. I've watched them, and I could totally pull another one out right now and start watching it. And you think like, wow, a 6-hour doc, that sounds like crazy. But then you'll watch like 5 parts of a documentary on TV on somebody or whatever. It's just the same thing. It's just all in one, and you can stop and start when you want. And it's like, it's just the way he's put them together is just so brilliant.
But when I said that I watched I think it was In Search of Darkness 2 for 5 hours solid on my computer, because we had a streaming version of it.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. I literally sat in front of my computer for 5 solid hours without interruption, maybe to get a drink of water or something, because they're that intriguing. Like, they're just so fascinating, and the pacing is great. And it's like, if you have any interest in horror at all, or grew up watching these things, you will not regret owning these docs, because they're just so brilliant. They're just so good. Yeah.
And I'm really interested in this one particularly because the 80s, again, we know that, like, not every little bit of it, but we know it enough because we lived it. The 90s is a forgotten decade a little bit. And then there's a lot of stuff I kind of rediscovered just in talking to him and just looking at the trailer. And so I'm interested to see where they really go with this doc. It's going to be really cool.
Exactly. We get to relive another decade.
There you go. Well, that's it for us for another episode of Loop and Larry, Guardians of Geek. Again, check out our socials, and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Produced by Matthew C. Loop and Lawrence Simner. A Loop and Larry production.
Bueller.
He likes it. Hey, Mikey.
Bueller.
Bad news. Fog is getting thicker.
And Leon's getting larger.
Inconceivable. Brian's right. It's an elf.
Wax on.
Does Barry Manilow know that you raid his wardrobe?
Oh, Captain, my captain.
Life moves pretty fast. You don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it.
Wax off.